so good to be here with you today. My name is Jason Castelli. I'm one of the pastors here, and I'm excited that we get to wrap up this series, Best Gift Ever. You know, this Christmas season is really a time where we become obsessed with gifts. And I'm not just talking about getting gifts, we all like that, but even giving gifts. I mean, just think about it. How many of us just wait in traffic, go to overcrowded stores to buy a gift card for our third cousin whose name we can't even remember? Right? That shows that we love giving gifts. And so we thought as a church it'd be appropriate to take a few weeks to talk about sharing something that's worthwhile. And so if you haven't been around over the past couple of weeks, or maybe you're new here today, let me catch you up to speed. For the past 2 weeks, we've talked about regifting the greatest message that history has ever known, the gift of a restored relationship with Jesus Christ. And 2 weeks ago, Paul McGinnis shared with us that the way we live should show we have something to give. It's really this idea of living as a demonstration, that when people look at you and when people look at me, it should cause them to question. It should cause them to ask, what makes us different? What sets us apart? And then last week, Mark Fitch just did a fantastic job laying out a blueprint for how we can have a conversation about the gospel, how we could start to begin to engage people with simple illustrations in a clear and concise way so that we could explain what Jesus accomplished on the cross. And let me just say, I'm so thankful for those two guys, and I'm so thankful for what they shared because I believe it's essential. I believe we need to live a life of demonstration, and I believe we need to know how to share the gospel in a clear and concise way. But as I've been following Jesus, as I've been sharing my faith with others, here's something that I've learned, that sharing Christ with others is often more than a one-time conversation. It just is. It typically doesn't happen just that one time through the context of one conversation. As a matter of fact, for most people, coming to faith is a journey. It takes place over time. And I believe on our part, it requires relational investment. It requires friendship. It requires us to do life with other people. And so we want to talk about today, how do we do that? Because you might not have realized, but over the past 2 weeks, we've really been talking about this idea of evangelism. And listen, I know evangelism isn't a word we throw around a lot. It's actually a really churchy word, but it simply means sharing our faith with others or telling others about Jesus. But here's what we've done as Christians. We've taken this term and we've made it into something really, really complicated. That's something we do a lot as Christians. We take something simple and we make it harder than it has to be. But the thing is, we're not strangers to evangelism, are we? Like, even if you're not a Christ follower, you have some experience with evangelism, and it's probably a negative one. But listen, you're not alone. Okay, because many Christians here in the room have had an equally negative experience with evangelism. It doesn't really matter if you're on the receiving end or the giving end. Most of us have had a bad experience. And I think we do that because we're not doing it the right way. And listen, that's what happens when we overcomplicate something, right? If you're like me, if you make something more complicated than it has to be, you just don't do it at all. Right? Like exercise or eating right. We don't do those things when we make them more complicated than they have to be. And the same is true of evangelism. And we've taken the greatest gift ever, the best gift ever, and we've begun to share it in ways that oftentimes feels like the worst gift ever. And can I suggest that if telling other people about Jesus Christ doesn't sound like good news, it's because you're doing it wrong. Have you guys ever seen those memes online? A meme is really a picture or something that really just gets really popular really fast. Some of my favorite memes carry this catchphrase, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. And a lot of them are really funny, but you kind of have to experience them. You have to see them to get them. So let me share with you some of my favorites. All right, first question for you guys out there. Anybody a Twitter user? Anybody have Twitter? Yes, a bunch of you. If this is your idea of Twitter, you're doing it wrong, right? There should be no need for carrier pigeons. You're making that way more complicated than it has to be. All right, next question. Any soccer fans out there? Any soccer lovers? Yes. So then you know what a header is supposed to look like. But if this is your idea of a header, you are doing it wrong, and it is going to cause you a whole lot of pain. All right, this next question is kind of a give me, because we all love music, don't we? Each one of us has our own specific taste in music. We all love some kind of music. But if this is your idea of music, You are doing it wrong. Listen, I know 13-year-old girls right now, they want to stone me, and a couple really odd 40-year-old guys, but listen, you're doing it wrong. All right? Or how about this last one? Any Apple fans out there? Anybody own an iPhone, an iPad, a MacBook computer? Yeah, almost all of us, right? If this is your idea of Apple, you are doing it wrong. And I know these are kind of funny, but as I look at these, I can't help but think of some of the ways that we share Christ with others and the wrong ways that we do that. Let me share a few of those with you. This first one I call the tipper. All right, now let me explain this. What you see on the screen there is a track. And there's nothing wrong with a track. A track is meant to be a clear and easy way to share the gospel with somebody else. That's a good thing. But how you use it makes all the difference. And all the ones that look like this need to be thrown away. Because what this is when you fold it in half, it looks like a real $20 bill. And there's Christians who leave this as tips in restaurant. And when the server comes over and opens it up, and it says disappointed, you better believe they're disappointed. But they're not disappointed because they don't know Jesus. They're disappointed because they had you at their table, the cheapo that didn't leave them a tip, the person that made them think they were getting $20. Don't ever do this. You're doing it wrong. Or this next one, we all have that friend or that family member. We call them the messenger. We get like 17 emails a day. We have that aunt, that uncle, that coworker, and they bombard us with these emails that make us feel guilty. Like if we don't share these with 30 people in the next 3 minutes, then we don't love Jesus or something really bad is going to happen to us. Let me just ask you a favor. Take us off your email list. All right? We don't want them. This isn't helping anybody. I'm sorry. Or this next one, it's a little more direct. We call it the billboard, right? Ask me why you deserve to go to hell. I bet that guy's having a whole bunch of conversations with people, isn't he? No way. I mean, you've seen this person in the city, maybe even in Scranton or Wilkes-Barre. And what do you do when you see that? You cross the street, right? Because you don't want to even look that person in the eye. Nobody wants to have a conversation with that guy. Or this last one. I like this last one. It's called the creeper van. All right, I named that myself. And this guy tries to make the most of every single opportunity. I mean, he could be driving down the interstate to work and sharing the good news with people, right? Parents, don't let your kids near this guy. Just a word of advice, right? Listen, if you find yourself doing any of these, could I just suggest that you are doing it wrong? And listen, I get your heart behind it. You want to share Jesus with other people, and that is a good thing. But your approach is way off, because any time we share the good news in a way that's not perceived as good news means that we're doing it wrong. So how can we share the gospel in a way that draws people closer to the heart of God rather than push them away? How can we share our faith in a way that is actually received as good news? I don't think we have to look any further than Jesus. If you have your Bible, you could turn to John chapter 1 or turn on your smartphone and find your way there. That's where we're going to be hanging out today. And the book of John is an account written by Jesus' best friend, whose name just so happened to be John. And John's sole purpose for writing this account of Jesus' life was so that others would know him. John states at the end of his book this way. He says that you would believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and that by believing, you would have life in his name. See, John wants people to know about Jesus. And that's because John had a personal relationship with Jesus. I mean, they walked the earth together. John traveled with Jesus. John watched Jesus perform miracle after miracle. John watched as Jesus interacted with people in everyday life. They ate meals together. Even when Jesus was dying on the cross, they were so close that John was given charge of Jesus' mother. Jesus said, John, I want you to take care of my mom for me. I mean, that's tight, isn't it? You know that if you want somebody taking care of your mom, that you trust that person, that you love them. John had a personal relationship with Jesus, and he wanted others to know about it. In fact, what's so cool about John is that he defined his entire identity by being loved by Jesus. Throughout this account of John, he simply refers to himself as the one that Jesus loved. And see, John understood something that I think you and I just forget way too easily, or we just miss altogether. It's this idea that Jesus is personal. Check out what John says in in John 1. He says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." Really, what John's describing here in that passage is what's known as the incarnation, the act of God taking on flesh, the act of God becoming a man. And this is so huge. This is so huge because God is personal. Jesus is personal. The gospel is so personal. When God hatched a rescue plan to make a way to get people back to himself, he didn't send an underprivileged angel. He sent his one and only Son. The God of the universe took on flesh and stepped into human history. And he didn't only become a man, but he chose to become a helpless baby who would be dependent on his mother and his father. And when I think of the Christmas story, when I think of God becoming a baby, I can't help but think of my daughter Evelyn. She's almost a year old already, but she still relies on her mom and I for everything. We have to feed her and change her and bathe her. We have to keep her from getting into trouble when she crawls around the house at Mach 3. She always seems to go to the most dangerous places, and we have to be there to stop her. We have to be there to help her. Now just wrap your minds around this if you can. Jesus needed his diaper changed. The God of the universe wore Pampers and crawled around. That is crazy. But it shows us that God is personal. And I think if we're going to take our cues from Jesus, if there's one thing that we could learn from the incarnation, it's this, that we need to make it personal. If you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. Make it personal. That's what God did in the incarnation. He said, I'm going to come to you and I'm going to do something about what you cannot do for yourself. He made it personal. And really the scriptures, with the exception of a few, they really pick up on Jesus' life when his ministry starts around age 30. And oftentimes because of that, I don't think we think about his early life. And listen, just because we don't have details about it doesn't mean it didn't happen. Jesus was born into a poor family. He had a mother and a father. He had brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles. He had friends and classmates. He had awkward moments. He had acne. He went through puberty. Right? God immersed himself in humanity. He made it personal. And I think if we're going to share our faith in a way that's effective, we need to make it personal. We need to follow his lead. And by the way, I'd be super thankful if someone were writing an account of my life and they left out my awkward teenage years too. See, I think God knew what he was doing when he inspired the writers of the Bible. He didn't want some of those details in there. But the details that we have about Jesus' life are fascinating, and they help us understand what it means to make it personal. So for the rest of our time today, we're going to look at a few accounts recorded for us in the book of John, where Jesus demonstrates for us how to make it personal. And listen, here's why this is so important. God's plan for helping people find the way back to him has always been other people. Did you catch that? God wants to use us to help people find the way back to him. This is huge. The way we say that around here is found people, find people. And so we're going to take a little survey to get started here, okay? So I need everybody with me. So Wilkes-Barre, you still paying attention? Clark Summit, are you listening in? Or even if you're at home, online, watching this in your pajamas, eating cereal, I want you to play along with me. Okay? So by show of hands, how many of you began a relationship with Jesus because of a relationship that you had with someone else? Or to state it another way, how many of you trusted Christ as your Savior because of the influence of a friend or a family member? Yes, almost all of us. Because God's plan has always been a relational model. And so I truly believe that the best way we can make it personal, the best way we could share our faith with others is by sharing our life with them. So let's look at how Jesus did that. The first way that Jesus made it personal was by becoming accessible. Accessibility. If there's one thing the gospel taught us, if there's one thing the story of the incarnation we could learn from it, it's this, that God made himself available. But listen, this didn't just happen one time in the stable. in Bethlehem. This is something that Jesus modeled over and over and over again. Check out how he does that with a guy named Nicodemus. John chapter 3. Now there was a Pharisee, a man named Nicodemus, who was a member of the Jewish ruling council. See, Nicodemus comes to Jesus. He's a member of the Jewish ruling council. What that means is that Nicodemus, he had experience with religion, but he was also a seeker. He never had a relationship with God, and he's intrigued by Jesus. He wants to know more about him. Maybe for some of you, that's why you're here today. That's great. Check out what happens. He came to Jesus at night and said, "Rabbi, we know that you are the teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him." Did you catch this little phrase here? He came to Jesus at night. Sometimes it's so easy to overlook the details that are found in the Bible. And what this tells us, he came to Jesus at night because he was ashamed, because he was scared of his reputation, because he was a ruling leader in Israel, and they didn't really like Jesus. And so Nicodemus says, "Hey, I'm going to come to you at night." And you know what? Jesus, he knew what he was up to, but he made himself accessible even when it was extremely inconvenient. And by the way, maybe some of you know what that feels like, to kind of be like, I don't want others to know I'm trying out this church thing. I remember feeling that way when I first started coming to Parker Hill from my Catholic church. I really didn't want my friends to know who went to CCD with me. I really didn't want my family to know because I was a little worried about what they might think. It's kind of normal for us to be a little intimidated, a little worried about what people might think, but we are so glad that you were here and that you were checking it out. And I love what we learn from Jesus here, that he makes himself accessible. In his book, Bob Goff talks about one of his friends, a guy named Randy, who made himself accessible, even when it was extremely inconvenient for him to do so. Bob is kind of a crazy guy. We actually had the privilege as a staff to meet him about a year ago, and he just tells these stories of his life. And the more you listen to Bob, the more you just get drawn into his stories. And so as you read this book, I mean, it's got Bob all over it. This is how he lives life. And when Bob was in high school, he was a junior, he decided it was time to quit school and go live at Yosemite National Park. And that sounds really great to me. I mean, to just be able to rock climb and camp out all the time. Bob thought, I'm going to live the dream. So what he does is he just says goodbye to some people that are close to him. One of those people is the guy named Randy. He's kind of like his church small group leader. And so as a courtesy, he goes over to Randy's house. He says, "Listen, Randy, I just want to let you know, today, right now, I'm taking off. It's been a pleasure. I'll see you later." And Randy, he's acting really strange. Like he's not even opening the door. He's just kind of peeking his head out. And he says, "Bob, just give me a few minutes." And about 10 minutes later, Randy emerges from the house with a backpack and a sleeping bag. And all he says to Bob is, "Bob, I'm with you." And the two of them head off to Yosemite, but their adventure only lasts a few days because Bob's got $75 in his wallet, and they run out of gas and they run out of food, and they decide it's time to come home. And so when they come back to Randy's, Bob is really, really puzzled. He's like, what is going on here? Because when Randy opens the door, Bob sees stuff like a new microwave still in the box and a coffee maker and wrapping paper laying all around. He was kind of thinking, was it his birthday? Did I miss something? But Randy's girlfriend emerges from one of the rooms, and she says, with this just extravagant voice, "Honey, welcome home." See, what had happened, what Bob didn't know, is that just about a week earlier, Randy's girlfriend became his wife. He was newly married. They were so newlywed, they didn't even get a chance to open all of their gifts yet. I mean, that's crazy. Randy made himself accessible even when it was extremely inconvenient to him. And that experience, that marked Bob for a lifetime. Listen to what he says in his book. He says, "Randy didn't just say he was for me or with me, he was actually present with me. What I learned from Randy changed my view permanently about what it meant to have a friendship with Jesus. I learned that faith isn't about knowing all the right stuff or obeying a list of rules. It's something more costly, because it involves being present and making a sacrifice. Perhaps that's why Jesus is sometimes called Emmanuel, God with us. I think that's what God had in mind for Jesus to be present, to be just with us. It is also what he had in mind for us when it comes to other people. And I love that story. I love it because I know what happened. I love it because it models so well what Jesus did for us. See, this wasn't just a one-time occurrence that Jesus did this for a guy like Nicodemus. He did it all the time. He made himself available, even when it was inconvenient. I mean, God left heaven to become a person. Talk about inconvenience. And if we're going to take our cues from Jesus, then we need to make room for some disruption in our lives. Because one of the reasons I think we don't do an effective job at sharing our faith is because we don't have time to be interrupted. We don't have time to interact with the people that God puts in our path. And that's a tragedy because God wants to use us to impact other people. So let's open up our schedules. Let's make some room for that. And by the way, that's why we try to keep things pretty simple here at Parker Hill. Like, we don't want you to be here 2 or 3 or 4 days a week. We want you to actually be out building relationships with people who don't know Jesus. We want you to be able to live your life as a demonstration. We want you to have time to have those conversations. We want you to make it personal. And by the way, this is something we take really, really personal as a church. I mean, that's why we don't just have one campus and one location, but we're one church in many places, because we want to be accessible to where people are. We don't want to just expect people to come to us. We want to take church to them. And we know that it's easier for you to invite a friend along with you to experience Jesus if it's in your neighborhood. We want to partner with you in that way. We want to be accessible like Jesus was accessible. Another thing we learned from Jesus, he wasn't just accessible, but he associated with the unaffiliated. Can you say that with me? Associated with the unaffiliated. And we all know what it means to be unaffiliated, don't we? It just means we don't belong to a certain group. Listen, we all want to fit in. We all want to belong. But we also know what it feels like to be left out, to be overlooked. Maybe for you it was when you were in high school and you didn't make the sports team. Or maybe it was more recently when that company passed you by because you just weren't the material they were looking for. See, one of the things that's so attractive about Jesus is that he constantly associated with those who were ignored or overlooked. And one of the ways he does that is with a woman at a well. John tells us about it in John chapter 4. Listen to this. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. So Jesus is on this road trip with his disciples. They're going from Judea to Galilee when they take a pit stop in Samaria. And John gives us this little detail. He says they had to go to Samaria, which is really interesting because geographically speaking, that just wasn't true. As a matter of fact, most Jews in that day went out of their way to avoid Samaria. If you live in Northeast Pennsylvania, it's kind of like how people from Scranton avoid going to Wilkes-Barre and how people from Wilkes-Barre avoid going to Scranton. It's just crazy because in that culture, the Samaritans were considered inferior. But Jesus, he didn't see things that way. So he begins to have a conversation with this woman. Check this out. It was about noon when a Samaritan woman came to draw water. Now, I don't know if you saw that. It was about noon. That's a huge detail. What John does here is he cues us into the fact that this is no ordinary woman. All right? First of all, she's a Samaritan woman, but she's an outcast among outcasts because nobody in this culture went to the well at noon. Everybody did so in the evening when it was cooler. And when you went to the well, you would make sure to gather enough water for the entire next day so you didn't have to come out in the heat of lunchtime. But this woman is there all by herself, an outcast. And John tells us later on in the story why she's an outcast. She's known as the town tramp. She has been married and divorced 5 times, and now she's on guy number 6. This is a woman that people went out of their way to avoid. They did not want to be seen with her. They did not want to associate with her. But Jesus, he doesn't see things that way. And so this conversation happens. Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. And even she is surprised by this request. Listen to what she says. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus makes it personal. He's not going to avoid this woman because of the baggage of her past. He doesn't care about being associated with her because he knows that she has value. Jesus constantly prioritized people over his religious traditions, over his customs, just over everything, because Jesus understood something. People matter to God, especially people who are far from God. And again, this wasn't a one-time occurrence in Jesus' life. He did this often. He's so often associated with the unaffiliated that he gained himself a nickname, the friend of sinners. And I believe that's a nickname that Jesus took personally, because that reflects the heart of God. And listen, if we're going to take our cues from Jesus, we need to build relationships with people who are different than us, people who don't share the same values, people who don't share the same beliefs, people who don't even share some of our own preferences. We can't look past people and overlook them and judge them. If we're going to take our cues from Jesus, we have to take time to get to know their story and to be involved in their story, because that's what Jesus did. Could I be honest with you for a minute? I think this is one of the reasons why churches aren't growing today, because they kind of just do what's expected of them. And when you just do what's expected of you, you're not going to see anything significant happen. What most churches do is they affiliate with the already associated. Like they only take time to think about people who are already bought in, people who already believe. But I love what Craig Rochelle, he's a pastor out in Oklahoma City, says. He says, if we're going to reach people that no one else is reaching, we have to do things that nobody else is doing. And can I tell you, that's one of the things that I love about this church. We're not worried about just keeping the religious people happy. We want to reach people who are far from God, because that's what matters to Jesus. And one thing that I think is so cool about Parker Hill is that this is a place where you can belong even before you believe. And for some of you, that's really the case, right? Listen, I know you're not 100% sold yet on what it means to have a relationship with God. In fact, I know some of you are even kind of skeptical about that, but you come here each and every week because you like what you experience, or at the very least, you like who you experience it with. And I think that's what Jesus had in mind for his church, because people who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus, because he made it personal. See, Jesus made it personal not just by being accessible and not just by associating with the unaffiliated. It went much deeper than that. At the heart of everything Jesus did, it's because he had an affection for people. And that affection for people affected him. See, Jesus never treated people like projects. They weren't just something to get off his to-do list. He genuinely loved and built authentic relationships with people. One of those relationships he had was with a guy named Lazarus. And he was friends with not only Lazarus, but also Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha. And we find out in John chapter 11 that Lazarus, he gets sick. And that sickness actually leads to death. But that didn't catch Jesus by surprise. He knew what was going to happen. Being the Son of God, he was a really hard guy to surprise. Mary never caught him with a surprise birthday party. It just didn't work. See, God had something in store for this sickness and for this death. God had intended Jesus to raise Lazarus from the dead as an incredible miracle. Jesus knew that, but what happens in this passage is so fascinating. Check this out. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Moved and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Don't miss this. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." The God who created the universe shed tears. Jesus experienced emotion the same way you and I experience emotion. This is Jesus who knows in a matter of minutes he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He's going to see him again. So what causes him to weep? He loved Lazarus. This wasn't just a teachable moment. This wasn't just some way to be able to show off who he was. Jesus loved him, and his heart broke for a family that he loved and for a friend that he lost, because Jesus was affected by his affection for people. So often so that it often caused him to act and do miracles that he wasn't planning on doing, because he was moved by people's situations and people's circumstances. See, Jesus loved Lazarus, and he loves you and I with that same love. It's what caused him to make it personal. It's what caused him to step into human history. Listen, if we are going to follow Jesus, we have to love people. We have to be moved by people. We can't be a follower of Christ and just be consumed with ourselves and our own comfort, because that is not the example that God set for us when he took on flesh. It is just not what he did. And listen, at the heart of it, this is what drives us as a church. Right? We love people. We believe that they are going to spend an eternity somewhere. And we truly believe that Jesus Christ is their only hope. He is our only hope. And listen, we believe that life is better with Jesus. Right? Just because we have Jesus doesn't mean our circumstances are going to change, and it doesn't mean that our financial situations are going to get better, but we believe that life is better with Jesus. And so we work hard to make sure that each and every week, this is a place where you could bring people to, where they could experience Jesus, where they could be helped on their journey. We don't think we're going to be the one-stop shop for their journey. We think you need to build a relationship with them, that you need to be ready to share the gospel, that you need to model the way that Jesus lived, that you have to love them and be invested in them. If we just think of evangelism as something to check off our to-do list, we will never be moved to do anything about it. But when we see sharing our faith with others as investing in real relationships with real people, we will give our life to making it personal. And that's what I want for you. That's what this church wants for you. And could I just share for a minute that what happens here each and every week is extremely personal for me? See, I grew up here in Northeast Pennsylvania, and I love this place. People think I'm crazy for it. I love the quirky culture. I love the people. I love the traditions. I love you guys. And what's so neat for me is that each and every week, I get to see old friends and classmates and teachers and neighbors come to this place where they could experience Jesus, because people just like you are investing in them, because you're making it personal. And what happens here in this place got a whole lot more personal for me a few months ago. See, I don't know if I've ever shared, but I came to Christ as a teenager at the age of 15 from a Catholic background, and no one in my family had a relationship with God. Most of them weren't even interested in religion. We did church at Christmas, Easter. That's just kind of what we did. Some of you guys, you know what that's like. You started off Christmas and Easter. It's a starting point. And as I came on staff here, and as I started attending here as a high school student, eventually my mom and my sister and my little brother and my sister's kids started coming here. And again, Christmas, Easter, a couple times a year, but I was thankful for that. I was so happy they showed up. But something began to happen in my sister's life over the past year. Actually, it was the first time I ever spoke on stage. She came, and I talked all about next steps, and my sister decided she needed to take a next step. So she joined a class where she learned a little bit more about what it meant to have a relationship with God, and that caused her to come here more regularly. She started coming pretty much every week. And so in the fall, as we were celebrating baptisms, I was just hanging out in the lobby with another one of the pastors, just talking, and I see my sister walk out the back door. And I just assumed she was leaving early because she works nights and sometimes she's got to take off a little early. So I went up to her and I just said, "Hey, did you enjoy the service? You heading home?" And she looked at me with tears in her eyes. And she said, "I'm getting baptized." In that moment for me, things got extremely personal. I got to go get changed and baptize my sister. This is a picture of her and I. And I will give my life to seeing people I love and care about coming to know Jesus. And I know the same is true for you, because last week you made it personal. You asked us to pray for 625 of your friends, of your family, of your coworkers. We actually have a picture of that. You might have seen this on Facebook. Listen, we are praying for them. We are partnering with you. And I don't know all the names on those pieces of paper. I don't know their stories. But here's what I do know. Your investment is worth it. If it takes the rest of your life, don't ever give up on those people, because those names represent stories, and those stories, they matter to God because people matter to God. Keep making it personal, because that is what it's all about. Just imagine with me what would happen if you and I made this personal. What would happen if we invested in relationships, if we made ourselves accessible? What would happen if we just didn't overlook people because they were different from you and I, but we built a relationship with them? What would happen if we just loved them and got them to a place where they could experience Jesus? And I'm not just talking about church, but I mean personally, to a place where they could make a decision. And maybe you're the one who will have that conversation that will lead them to that decision. I believe if we make it personal, we get to play an incredible part in a story that God is writing, a story that changes lives here and now, and a story that changes eternities forever. We could raise the spiritual temperature here in Northeast Pennsylvania by building relationships with people. That's what Jesus did. That's the example that he left for us. And that's what we want to do. We want to make it personal. Because 2,000 years ago, God stepped into human history and he made it personal. That's what Christmas is all about. So let's follow in his footsteps. Let's make it personal. Let me pray for us. Father, we thank you so much that you love us and that you pursued us. So much so that you left the comfort of heaven to take on flesh and to become the very thing that you created. And we are so thankful for Jesus Christ. We are so thankful that he made it personal. That he didn't just come to die for our sin, but he came to show us how to live our lives in a way that will make a difference eternally in the lives of other people. So God, help us. Help us to be accessible. Help us to make that time in our lives where we could build into people. Help us to associate with people who are different than us because they matter to you. And God, help us to be moved. Help us to have an affection, to love other people the way you love people, so that we could give our lives to doing something that really matters. Help us make it personal. We love you.